Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Hartigan, and I'm a senior writer with National Geographic. Today, we're continuing our conversation, our celebration of women's suffrage, and talking about the ongoing fight for political representation. It took more than 70 years for suffragists to get the vote for women. But even after the 19th Amendment passed, state and federal laws still made it difficult, if not impossible, for women of non-white women to vote. 100 years later, equal political representation still hasn't been achieved. But we have people here who are working on it. I'm thrilled to be here with two women who are continuing the centuries-long tradition of women fighting for equal rights. Nicole Montclair-Donaghy is the Executive Director of North Dakota Native Vote. She's coming to us from Bismarck, North Dakota. And Ai-jen Poo is the Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, co-director of Caring Across Generations, and co-founder of Supermajority. And she is joining us from Chicago. Thank you to both of you for being here. So let's jump right in. Among the women who couldn't vote when the 19th Amendment passed were Native people who weren't acknowledged as citizens until 1924. And Native communities now still face barriers to voting. So Nicole, can you tell us about the work of North Dakota Native Vote?
Sure, so thank you for having me. So North Dakota Native Vote was began in 2018 in response to the voter identification law that was upheld by the Supreme Court in that same year that required all North Dakotans to have a physical address on their identification cards. And so that limited a lot of people from even trying to get a ballot, because on reservations, we don't have traditional street addresses. All of our mail comes by post office. And so that's how North Dakota Native Vote came into being. Since then, we've created a full year-round organization that is working on enhancing Native leadership, building power for our tribal communities, and getting people involved in community organizing so that they are at the table when decisions are made for our people.
Thank you, Nicole. And also looking back, women labor activists were crucial to pushing women's suffrage over the finish line. Ai-jen, can you talk about how the three organizations that you work with sort of form a similar intersection of labor activism and political representation?
Sure, thank you for having me. And it's really an honor to be in conversation with you and Nicole. So at the National Domestic Workers Alliance is an organization that represents the millions of women, mostly women of color, who work in our homes, providing caregiving and cleaning services. And it's incredibly vital work. And it's the work that makes everything else possible, right? Makes it possible for us to do what we do, knowing that some of the most important parts of our lives, our most important people in our lives are in really good hands. And yet it's some of the most undervalued and invisible work in our economy today. And there's a long history behind that. And the National Domestic Workers Alliance is a growing community of domestic workers that's trying to change that, to bring dignity and respect to the work and to make domestic work jobs and all care jobs really good jobs that you can take pride in, support your family on, and see real opportunity. And Caring Across Generations is a coalition that we started in 2011 to really bring together all the people who need care, older people, people with disabilities, family caregivers, together with the caregiving workforce to put forward a new vision for the care economy that would not only allow for wider universal access to the care that we need to take care of our families, but ensure that all the jobs in the care economy are really good jobs. And as a sister organization to that family of groups, we also, there's also an organization called Care in Action, which is a 501c4 organization that's focused on building political power and representation for women of color, especially women of color working in low-wage service jobs like domestic work. And Supermajority.
You do a lot.
Yeah, exactly. I have a lot of homes.
Mm-hmm.
And Supermajority is a newish organization that was launched to capture and project the power of the supermajority of women in this country, who power everything and yet are still underrepresented. And we hope to build the largest program, woman-to-woman voter mobilization program in history, to participate in this election.
Wow. So our conversation is sort of based on the assumption that representation is a good thing, and that seems kind of obvious, but can you both talk about why representation is important in general and maybe specifically in the communities that you're working with? I don't know who wants to start. Jenny, want to start?
Sure, I can kick it off by saying, one, that whether it's in our democracy or in our economy, you cannot value what you cannot see. And for us, representation is not just about what we see, but what that makes possible, what representation from our communities makes possible in politics, but also in policy, right? So having the ability for young girls of color to see women running for every office up and down the ballot, and to know that they could be the president of the United States or vice president, is really transformative, because it does open up the realm of what's possible, right? That visibility is not just about that visibility, it's about the realm of what's possible. And in policy, it's the same thing. It's what representation from the experiences of our communities mean when you're trying to solve problems, when you're trying to create policy, when you're trying to change systems, to be able to do it from the vantage point of some of the least visible and most vulnerable communities in the country is actually essential to creating policy solutions that lift everyone, where no one is left behind. And so I just think it's not just about who we see, but it's about what that means in our politics, in our families, in our communities, in our sense of self, and also from a policy standpoint.
Yeah, policies can't be developed if you don't know that they're about the people that they're supposed to be serving, helping. What about you, Nicole? Why do you think representation is so important?
Yes, so like you said earlier, Rachel, Native American people have not been able to vote until 1924 in best cases. And so we've been on what we call Turtle Island since time immemorial. And we are just now at a point where other communities are realizing that we also need to be represented. Native American people have been here forever. We need to have that representation, and we need to be at the table when these decisions are made, or at least being involved when there are decisions being made. And so, like tribal nations, when you live on a reservation, you have to deal with 5 different forms of government. You have to deal with state, city, county, federal, and tribal. And so we should always be aware of what's happening to us, and we should always have that opportunity to use our voice. And so working in the work that we do, I've also worked in oil and gas communities where decisions were being made, where people didn't know that these decisions were being made, yet the pollution and all of the externalizing of operations was impacting the land and water and the air that they breathe. And so I think that representation is important at all levels, from nonpartisan seats like school boards all the way up until to the governor. We need to have that voice.
So did it make a big difference in 2018 that finally 2 Native American women were elected to Congress?
That is an amazing feat, and they are true inspirations to me. Sharice David and Deborah Holland. And it also goes to show that there's more Native American women coming. There's more of us coming. There's more of us on our way. And one great case in our state is Ruth Anna Buffalo, who is the first Democratic House of Representatives, sits in the North Dakota House of Representatives. She ran a true grassroots campaign and knocked on doors and logged hundreds of miles and just getting her voice out there. It takes a lot of work, and we just didn't fall from the sky. There's so many women that have laid that path before us, and Ruth and Deb and Sharice are those ladies that are making those trails.
Yeah.
Can I just add something to that?
Sure.
So, first of all, I'm waiting for Nicole to run for office. Second of all, I just want to shout out Congresswoman Deb Holland for a minute, because I was just on a Zoom with her yesterday about caregiving. And she's not only representing the interests of Native people in Congress and her own constituents, but she's representing the interests of millions, tens of millions of caregivers who have no voice in our politics or in our policy. And she has been championing laws and resolutions and initiatives that lift up family caregivers, lift up professional caregivers. And she talks about her own personal experience where she was not able to afford childcare. And so she had to both figure out how she was going to work and earn a living and income and support her family and take care of her own kids. As her parents got more frail, she was a family caregiver. She talks about those direct experiences, and those direct experiences translate into policy. And so I think sometimes when we think about representation from just an identity lens, we think about, right, that's actually quite important. It's also about the values and the experiences that get reflected, whether they have to do with race specifically or not. I just think we have so much brilliance, to Nicole's point, and talent that has been suppressed by a political system and process that is unjust and unequal. And if we actually removed some of those obstacles and had a really reflective democracy, there would be so much creativity and brilliance that would be unleashed to solve the very challenging problems that we face as a nation. My friend Franklin Leonard, who runs the Blacklist, always talks about the film Hidden Figures. I don't know if you saw that film.
Oh, yeah.
But what he says about it, which I thought was so wise, is the thing that the big takeaway there is that if those women, given all the barriers that they faced as Black women, were still able to take us to the moon, imagine if those barriers didn't exist. Would we all be flying around in jetpacks, or right. Like solar powered jetpacks?
Yeah.
You know, I think it's just a reminder that we are all harmed by the barriers that exist to Native communities, Black communities, immigrant communities from full and complete political participation and power in our democracy.
Yeah, that reminds me, one thing that struck me about the suffragists is they were sort of building power from not much. They didn't have much access to power. And one thing, Jen, that you said to me, I spoke to you, I think, right when everything was shutting down in March, you talked about how you had to think about building power for people who don't have it. Like, how do you create something out of nothing? But it's not really nothing. But how do you do it?
It's only nothing in the context of a system that erases and invisibilizes people. And what we have to do is we have to invent and imagine new systems and new cultures and new ways of being. And I think both Nicole's work and our work in the domestic workers movement has been about how do we create new frameworks that see and value people who have been undervalued and invisibilized in our culture and our politics. And once we start to do that, and we do it collectively, it's transformative. We call it building power from the margins until the margins disappear, right? It's like our ideas, they start in the shadows because they have to, because of the kinds of disenfranchisement that we've been subjected to. But those ideas in the end are the ideas of the future. And I think that that's what we're seeing now with a lot of the work of people who've been trying to build power from places of very little power and access. That's the innovation, that's the future, and that's how we get to the kind of multiracial democracy that we deserve and that is actually possible in this country.
Yeah. One thing, in one of our previous events, the historian Martha Jones was talking about voting, and she was talking about, I mean, that's a form of power, obviously. I mean, it might not seem like much, but one vote at a time is a form of power. And she talked about the tactical importance of voting, but she also talked about the symbolic importance of voting. And I wonder, Nicole, if you could talk a little bit about that symbolic importance of both, you know, having this law passed in North Dakota that made it harder for Native North Dakotans to vote, but then getting people to do it. Like, what does that mean to people to be able to vote?
Well, so in our communities, in Native American communities, I mean, we've always had pride in this land. We've always protected this land, and having that ability to vote on these lands and decide who's in power is a big deal for us. Mm-hmm. A lot of our communities, like I said earlier, are not able to speak for ourselves when it comes to decision making, and too often, like, we get left out, and people don't think that we're here anymore. And so, taking that step to make sure that our communities have the right to vote is monumental for our communities that are on the margin, and having people understand that their right to vote is huge, especially in Indian country. I've heard statistics at one point in 2018 where it said that the Native vote was 5 more times powerful than off reservations, because we are not able to vote and as easily and conveniently as people off the reservation. And so it's something that we are educating our people with, that this right to vote has been ours since 1924, but it's not always an easy task for us. And so always remembering that, and the symbolic meaning behind it of just having that voice and standing your ground on this land where we were, mm-hmm. where we always have been.
Yeah. What about you, Ai-jen? What about the people you're working with who are, and totally correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems hard to sort of build up a movement with people who are, you know, one person is working in one house, you know, the people are sort of separated. How do you build up this movement? And then what does participating in the political process mean to people who may be somewhat isolated?
Yeah. It's always the people with the least amount of power who understand just how important power is. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you a story of our democracy has so many hidden sheroes and heroes. And I consider Nicole one of them. And another one for me is a woman named Dorothy Bolden, who was a domestic worker in Atlanta, Georgia in the 1950s and 60s. And as the civil rights movement was building momentum, she was actually a neighbor of Martin Luther King Jr.'s. And she went and knocked on his door and she said, I want to be a part of this movement. I want in. And he said to her, great, organize the domestic workers. And she did. She formed the National Domestic Workers Union, which ended up organizing thousands of Black domestic workers throughout the South and winning pay raises and a lot of progress in that time. And the only requirements, and she's our kind of movement mother, she's our ancestors who we have built upon. But the only requirements to join the National Domestic Workers Union were that 1, you were a domestic worker, and 2, you were registered to vote. And for her, the right to vote and the ability to be empowered in your job were fundamentally connected. And I do think that we have lost the connection between having power in the economy and having power in our democracy, and it's actually fundamentally connected. It is not an accident that our unequal system just keeps becoming unequal, because the concentration of power and wealth is just increasing at the very, very top. And that is political power that's being concentrated in the service of economic power, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what we have to do to democratize our economy and our politics is to really remember the integration of those two things, and to figure out how we put more power in the hands of everyday people, in the ballot box, at the ballot box, in the workplace, in the community. That's what has to happen for real change to happen in this country.
Well, can you talk about supermajority then? I mean, underrepresentation doesn't necessarily mean that your numbers are a minority. Women are a majority, but not, I'm not articulating this very well, but a majority in numbers may be a minority in power. What do you hope supermajority will do?
I mean, the whole point is to change that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, I think we power everything as women. I mean, growing up, being raised by my mom and my grandmother, I literally thought they walked on water. They did everything. They powered everything in our home and in our community, and they went to work, and then as I grew older, I realized the disconnect between the fact that they do all the work and power everything, but they don't actually make all the decisions, right? And they don't actually have the power to make all the decisions. And that I just saw how much of a disconnect there was between the role of women in everything and the actual amount of power and decision making that we have as women. And I think supermajority is really trying to bridge that gap, where we are more than half the workforce, half the electorate, right? We're so many things, and we've never aggregated our power to say that the women's agenda is the agenda, right?
Not women's issues, it's everyone's issues.
It's everyone's issues. I mean, the fact that we're the majority of everything and yet we're still treated as a special interest group is one of the most absurd narrative and cultural kind of Jedi mind tricks that I've ever, you know. And so I just think we have this moment where I think women are on fire and awakening to that contradiction in new ways every single day. And, you know, it's just, and I think women like Representative Holland are just breaking the doors open for so many of us. This year, there are more Black women running for United States Congress than ever in history. And this is how we're going to do it. We're going to show up at the polls in unprecedented numbers, and we're going to keep just opening those doors and changing those systems.
Yeah. Nicole, at one point, I think when we spoke in the spring, you talked about how you are part of a matriarchal society, and most of the work being done at the grassroots level is being done by women. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that plays out in the community, on the ground, in your work. How do the women take charge?
Yeah, so historically, I mean, our at least in our Lakota culture, women were decision makers. We were a matriarchal society. We still are, and that has been brought forward through all like the centuries. Women are the nurturers. Women are the backbone of the nation, and there's this old saying that my ancestors used to say is that men did the dangerous work, but women did the impossible. And so
I like that.
So women have always had this role, at least in our culture, to make decisions, but in more contemporary times, it is women that is leading the way, because we see the need, we have that nurturing heart, and we have that intuition and the strength to carry these movements. And I'm not saying that there's no men that are in there, but mostly it is women that is taking the charge here. And I really don't know why that is. I mean, maybe it's because our communities have adopted westernized society, this westernized westernized forms of government where, you know, women are still subjugated in some sense, but it is the women that have been leading a lot of these movements, at least in my region.
Mm-hmm.
Nicole, can you say the quote one more time?
Men do the dangerous work, but women do the impossible.
Okay, you need to make a t-shirt
Yes.
of that quote and have all the money raised go to your organization.
That's a great idea.
I still say we do a lot of dangerous work too, though. So
Yeah, impossible and dangerous.
That could be the like sub.
Yeah, I like that. So now you, Nicole, you've put in so many miles on your car. North Dakota is a big state. The reservations are spread out all over the place.
mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about just what you're doing as you're going from place to place? What, like how you do what you do?
Oh man, I pray a lot.
Yeah.
So in 2018, I was one of 2 field organizers on the ground for North Dakota Native Vote, myself and Prairie Rose Seminole. But we were covering a huge state, and all of our reservations are widely spread out, and of course across rural regions. And so I would sometimes take people with me, like my daughter. My daughter is a natural born organizer. She's 15 years old now, and she would come and help with the work that we're doing. Or I would listen to stories from, you know, I love audiobooks, and listening to like our oral histories is also something that's kept me going. But just being in that energy and being a part of the change and the movement that's happening in North Dakota, it makes my heart so full, and it makes me so proud to be a part of these movements and leading from behind. And so I'm not one for the spotlight, and I always get a little, you know, a little shy about things, but I really want, I have that love for my people, so that I really want to be that resource and give them the things that they need, so that they can, we all can rise together.
Mm-hmm. And are people receptive? I mean, do either of you ever run into people who say, well, the system is not welcoming to us, and why should I participate in this system that doesn't want me to be participating?
Yes, that does happen a lot, especially
Mm-hmm.
on our reservations. People are like, why, you know, my vote doesn't matter. Why
Mm-hmm.
should I vote? Why should I be counted in the census? Why should I get involved? You know, but I always tell them, any place that these decisions are being made, you are more welcome there. You need to be there. You belong there. You know, these are public processes, and we need to be a part of it. Otherwise, we'll be left behind. And so we have to just give our communities that education and that empowerment to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the reasons why our organizations are so important here. And I think more than any other election in history, this is the election where what's on the ballot is not the candidates. What's on the ballot is whether it's actually worth it to vote. And of course it is worth it. But I think that in the middle of a pandemic, with so much misinformation and disinformation and voter suppression, there is a very concerted effort to suppress the vote. And so we have a real uphill battle here to really remind people that democracies don't work if we don't participate. They just won't. There's no chance that it will work without us. And so everything that they care about, everything that they're worried about, everything that's maybe keeping them from actually prioritizing voting, like caring for their children or going to work where they're underpaid or not having health care, that's all on the ballot. And we have to remind people and encourage people and help people navigate the really complex environment that has been created by our current context.
Well, that leads to a question from our audience. So what gives you the most hope in this current moment? Do you hope that we will continue making progress?
this is going to sound kind of weird, but the thing that actually gives me hope is that people who are trying to suppress the vote and rig the system and keep people out of our democracy, they have to try to change the rules because they know that the majority of the people in this country want freedom, justice, inclusion, equity, caring, that in this country, in the end, the majoritarian values are towards empathy, compassion, and inclusion. And they have to change the rules to suppress us. And so it actually is a reminder that we have the power we need to make this the country of our dreams. And that gives me a lot of hope that like, listen, you know, you are not alone in your frustration. We are a majority, and if we do our jobs right, we can shape the future fundamentally. And I know so many organizers, so many domestic workers, so many women of color who are doing the hard work that Nicole is doing because they believe that too. And that is an inspiration to me. And I know that, you know, even just in the primaries that we've seen so far, where there's been a lot of voter suppression, people are standing in line for hours upon hours to realize their right to vote, and in the middle of a pandemic. And that is inspiring to me, right? Mm-hmm. That is what's going to protect and preserve and improve our democracy.
What about you, Nicole? Is there anything that's giving you hope?
Well, I have to, I mean, like, being an organizer, I always fall back on like our axioms for organizers, where you organize like hell for the living. You know, I have to have that type of mentality, but then deep down, I'm just a mom, you know, that just wants a better world for my kids. And in our culture, we plan ahead for 7 generations, and we want to have that, a better place for the future generations. And so that's what gives me a lot of my hope. And being in company of so many powerful women, I have mentors that I looked up to and that are right in the throes with us, you know, doing the same type of work, trying to build equity, trying to build power for our communities. That's what gives me a lot of hope, is knowing that there's so many people that are doing this work, and I'm not alone doing it.
Are you working to also kind of raise up people like your daughter or younger people to build up more leaders in the community too?
Yes, we are. Our slogan at our organization, North Dakota Native Vote, is to inspire Indigenous action. And you know, my daughter is one of many empowered young women that are on the rise, and so I'm just, yeah, there's more of us coming.
What about you, Ijen? Now, the Domestic Workers Organization, you're also sort of training up leaders too. Isn't that part of what you do?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
We have thousands of domestic worker leaders all over the country who are trying to pass bills in state legislatures and trying to win PPE for caregivers in cities, and it's been a really interesting time to see so much leadership grow in the midst of so many attacks on women of color, on immigrants, on so many people who don't have very much power, and to see the incredible resilience and determination has been the thing that's really carried me through the pandemic, is just how much leadership there is among women and women of color and working class people who really just want to be able to live with dignity. I mean, everybody's fighting right now, and it's a multi-generational movement that's building, and I think it has to be like and one of the beautiful things that I've learned from Native leaders has been this intergenerational connection, and the fact that in dominant American culture we're so siloed by generations, and that there are often breaks within our movements across generations, it just means that we end up making the same mistakes over and over again. And mistakes are inevitable. We're going to make mistakes. I just want to make new ones. I want our kids to make new ones, right? And to be able to build off of hard learned lessons from one generation to the next. So yes, we think a lot about intergenerational experience and support and leadership, and I think it's really crucial.
The pandemic raises a lot of issues. I think in 1918 with the flu, that actually in some ways sort of helped the suffragists because all the men were at World War, all fighting World War I. The women had to step up and sort of prove that they could be the nurses, that they could do all these things, and they sort of earned some credit that way. I wonder how much effect the pandemic will have. I mean, it'll have a kaleidoscope of effects, obviously, but how do you think it's going to affect political representation? One of you wants to take that?
Well, one thing is that I feel, this is one reason why I feel hopeful, is that the pandemic has revealed so many inequities and fragilities, and that we just have needed to address for a very, very long time. And the fact that we are now really honoring our essential workers who've been invisible, working in low-wage jobs as farm workers, as home care workers, as grocery workers, warehouse workers, delivery workers, all these low-wage service workers who have always powered, or not always, but have been powering our economy, suddenly recognizing that they are essential and that they are in many ways the cultural heroes of the moment. That is an opening for us to realize change and to see that the working class in this country is service-based, it's multiracial, it's a lot of women and people who've been working in the shadows for far too long and who deserve more than our applause, frankly. And I think that reminding us that this country, it's majority working class, and those are people who vote, and that all of that is, and the future of jobs in America, it's all on the ballot. And I think the fact that we are in such an unprecedented crisis, health crisis, economic crisis, and a crisis in our democracy, just means that I think people will start to make meaning in a new way of the connections between the three things, in a way that hopefully, if organizers like me and Nicole do our jobs right, will actually create a whole new set of possibilities in terms of policy solutions.
Nicole, how do you think the pandemic has affected your work?
So our communities, our Indigenous communities are already hard to reach communities. And so we've had to be really innovative in the way that we reach people. And so that means being more present online, putting dollars into ads so that people can see, like with the primary that happened here in June, some people didn't realize that there was a primary happening. And so I think that I know that we have to have that type of like unique reach to get to our communities. And so with some of the things that we've done in providing, where other organizations are providing relief to our communities with like food kits and such, we partnered with those organizations to put our information in so that they can have a way to contact us or see that we have like a landing site or landing page where they can get information, and just being more accessible in more ways. And that's really helped us in the work that we're doing. And also being where our people are. In fact, like on Facebook, I know Facebook, people give Facebook a lot of gives people think Facebook has a bad rep. It's just like older people, but but a lot of our Indigenous people are still using Facebook, and so we have identified the ways that we can do outreach and try to be more creative with those, and also using traditional means of media, newspaper ads, texting, mailers, stuff like that. And so it's just been interesting to see how people respond to the more traditional ways of organizing.
So we have a question from the audience. What would you say to people who have said they're not going to vote at all in this year's election because they feel pessimistic about the process and results?
Do you want to go, Adrian?
No, go ahead, Nicole.
I would say if you don't vote, then the election is decided then. I mean, like if you don't vote, then the person that you were planning to maybe vote for, loses another vote. And so you need to be there to have and use your voice. And especially with our people and Native people, we have that historical that history of not voting. And so I think it's time for us to make voting a tradition, and that's something that we just need to do.
I would say that cynicism is the enemy of progress, that there's just no way you can have expectations for yourself and your life to improve, or your kids' lives to improve if you sit it out. You gotta make a play, and really, if ever there was an election where that was so clear that our country is in deep crisis, and we are in need of leaders who reflect our values and who will solve for the tremendous era-shifting challenges of our time. Somebody had a really good metaphor about this, of termites, and you might just think that your one little vote doesn't matter because it's like a little termite, but it's actually like termites in that termites can take down the entire foundation of a house collectively, and each of us is one of those termites, and each of us needs to do our part in order for that foundation. Not that we're trying to bring down any foundations, but we are trying to reinvent and rebuild. And so I would say that one, it might feel small, but it's actually fundamental. And two, that we just can't be cynical. That's not a choice. And in fact, that's a privilege, because there are so many people who can't afford to not care.
Now, I think Supermajority had a study recently about low propensity voters. Why do people not vote? And is there something that could get them to vote?
Yeah, so many reasons. One is that most employers don't give election day off. And so if you're a low-wage worker working paycheck to paycheck, which 2/3 of all minimum wage workers are women, and those are not jobs where you can be like, hey boss, I'm gonna be late. So that's one thing. The other thing is childcare. Figuring out, especially if you're going to have to be in a line for 4 or 5 hours. I mean, in 2018, I was at the polls in Georgia, and there were people in line for 9 and 10 hours. What are you going to do with your kids? Right? So I just think there's a lot of different reasons why. And that's why we actually have to just really do the work and invest in people and really talk to people about why it's worth it, even if it's really hard, and that it really matters. And sometimes people need more support. We should be setting up childcare. We should be setting up, ride shares. A lot of people don't have transportation, right? That kind of thing. So, and I think we're trying to shift the frame from low propensity voters, which, There's lots of words that are kind of deficiency-based lens to high potential voters.
Yeah. Nicole, what about people on the reservations? What are some actual barriers that are getting in their way of voting?
So the voter identification law I mentioned earlier is still active. That law is still in the books, and so that is still a barrier. People need to verify their address and find ways to verify address, and sometimes that's not always an accurate address that they're assigned. But more recently, with the primary that we had here in North Dakota, it was an all vote by mail primary. We believe at North Dakota to vote that the elections should be free and accessible and fair, and it wasn't. I mean, that is not happening here in North Dakota. In one case, in my home reservation, since it was an all vote by mail primary, you had to find a way to obtain an absentee ballot, which the Secretary of State remedied that by sending out letters and telling them they can download the ballot online. That's if you have internet access, and that's if you have the ability to print a ballot. And then casting your ballot is also an issue here in North Dakota. So if you wanted to cast your absentee ballot, you either had to pay out of pocket. You know, in some cases it could be up to $2, which is a lot of money for people that are on a fixed income. Pay out of pocket to pay the postage, or in my case, in the case of my reservation, had to drive 40 miles one way in some of the towns to drop it in a free ballot box. And so that's some of the things that we've identified. And then being able to, or having the ability to track your ballot. You can track your ballot in North Dakota, but the Secretary of State or the county auditor that counts your ballot, if it is ruled as an invalid ballot, you are not notified. And so the state can cancel out your ballot if you cast it and there's something that, you know, the signatures that don't match. And so there's a lot of complexities with our electoral system in North Dakota that makes it almost impossible for some people in the very rural communities to vote.
Wow. And I mean, there's so many little rules too. You might not know when you're breaking the rule, like if your signature is a little bit off or whatever. Jen, do people encounter that you work with? Like,
yeah, there's yes, I mean, and I think in certain states you're now seeing people get dropped from the rolls, and people who've been registered for a very long time suddenly purged from the rolls in places like Georgia. And so I do think that it's really important to just, for everyone out there, to just double check that you're registered now, and to just confirm that. And then to make sure that you're aware of timelines around vote by mail, early voting, things like that. And Supermajority is a great resource for that if you have questions about that process. We're helping people figure all that stuff out.
One thing that struck me about when I was writing about the suffragists was, you know, they had to convince men to kind of share power with them ultimately. Do you feel like you have to convince people to share power with you? I mean, are we talking about a fixed pie of power? Or are we adding to the pie by including more people in the political process?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I do think that a defining characteristic of our existing political system, which was designed by and for men, is a culture of zero-sum politics, right? Where if you have power, it means I have less, right? And I actually don't think that that's how it works. And I don't think that women, I don't want to stereotype, or women are not a monolith, but from what I see in terms of how women's leadership works, it's less of a scarcity model and a zero-sum model and more of an abundance model around how do we design for maximum inclusion, right? And so I think that, yeah, I guess I would just say, like, that's part of the problem, that culture of if you have more, it means I have less, because this is a country that is so abundant in so many ways. And there's so much creativity and innovation, and it's just all directed towards more profits, more convenience, more efficiency, as opposed to greater equity and opportunity. And so we just have to figure out how we kind of reprioritize here, and think about how to deploy all of that creativity and innovation towards helping us actually realize the abundance in this country in such a way that allows everyone to be safe and whole and dignified in their lives. And we are far from there. And I know for sure that a zero-sum power model is not going to get us there.
Yeah. What can people do who, are not domestic workers or who are not natives in North Dakota to help? Maybe not to share power, but to build the amount of power that's out there. Nicole, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so I think that, I keep thinking about emergent strategy. I don't know if you've ever read the book, but where she talks about how oak trees are on a complex system underground, and hurricanes can pass through areas and the oak trees will still be standing. It's because they go underground and they connect their roots, and that's how they stay standing. And we need to do that. We need to find people where they're at and help them find their voice, or help them get to the polls, or we need to have those resources available. And like in our communities, like with you, what we were just talking about, power isn't shared. It's based on a deficit model. We need to go forward together and find people where they're at and give them the resources that they need. And so like organizations like North Dakota Native Vote, that's what we do. We let the people speak for themselves, and we give them that empowerment by giving them the resources. And so, excuse me. So what other people can do is talk to other people about the things that are important to you. If people, answer questions, if you have the ability to answer questions about people on the ballot and stuff like that, have those conversations and let people know that these things are important, and that their voice is important. Those are things that we value as an organization, is having those conversations and building that power from the roots upward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would just add that, I don't think this is the kind of time in our history where you want to look back and wonder if you did enough. I think that, your kids and your grandkids are going to ask you, where were you? What did you do? And we are in such deep crisis that it's an all hands on deck situation. And it doesn't mean you have to be like me or Monica and drive 10 million bajillion miles around your city. I think there's a way to find your lane based off of what feels authentic and true to you, but is about action and proaction, like proactivity towards whatever it means to you to do more than you thought you could, to be a part of the solution and to help us get out of this crisis.
Yeah, that's very powerful. So imagine that you all achieved everything you wanted to achieve. Everyone could vote with little friction, that there was representation of, all the people that make America a beautiful country. What would that look like to you? What is this, city on the hill? What does it look like?
That would look like me not having a job anymore. No, I'm kidding. Which would be great. I could go do something else. To be honest, I've thought about this, and it would, if we had equal representation, if we were no longer underfunded, under-resourced, and just no longer being subjugated, we would look like a suburb. our communities would have the things that we need. People would be at the table. We would have equal voice, and we would also have the ability to make that change and have people that are representing us that understand poverty, that understand issues in our communities. You know, if we had those type of people that were actually doing it for the people, like some of the women that we do now have in Congress, the world would be such a better place.
Yeah, if we would have a totally reflective democracy, and we would have bold policy that would reset our social safety net, our economy, and our democracy for this next era in history. And we would have universal access to childcare and long-term care and paid leave and healthcare. We would have the fundamentals covered. And so that it would be about a question of how we can contribute, how we can support and nurture the people that we love, and feel like you're making a meaningful contribution to this country without having to struggle so hard around the fundamentals. And there would be a lot more space for creativity and dynamism and art and music, and there would be a big cultural renaissance that came out of that, where we would be finding all these new ways of experiencing joy and learning from each other.
That sounds pretty great. So, well, thank you so much, Nicole and Jen. It's really been a wonderful conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot and gotten a bit of a window into the hard but essential work that you are doing, and I hope that our audience did too. Is there any last things you'd like to say, or any places you'd like to point people to in terms of your organizations? I'm sure you're all Googleable, but
you can follow me on Twitter at ijenpu, and I co-host a podcast called Sunstorm, which is all about how we continue to shine through the storms of our time and our politics. And it's co-hosted with Alicia Garza, who's one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. And I just really hope everybody's ready to do the work. Let's go.
thank you.
Yeah, you can follow North Dakota Native Vote on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or check us out on our webpage, ndnativevote.org.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you. Bye.
Thank you.